So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings. Thanks for being here with Sarah and I as we go through our August Inside Track. This is our regular series of presentations on all of the latest and greatest Ipsos polling we have. And now that we're really sort of approaching the start of the election calendar, you will start to see a little bit more focus on the horse race election coverage. After all, we do have the first Republican presidential debate next week. We'll be doing some polling on that. But we do have a lot of stuff to share with you today. I will start us off just talking about the issues, hierarchy of what we're dealing with, and I will pass it over to Sarah Feldman, our senior data journalist, who will take us through some data specifically about the economy, and then a bit of a hodgepodge of sort of the broader issue landscape. After all, there is a lot of issues facing the country right now. Then I'll take back the reins as we talk specifically about the multiple, for now, indictments against former President Donald Trump and the potential impact that might have on the election, and then the election more broadly with some of our latest horse race and political polling data. So let's get started. But as Ellen said, at any time, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to log that in using the Q&A function, and Sarah and I will loop back to those at the end of the call. So the main issues, the issue landscape. So this is from our Reuters Ipsos Core Political Tracking Survey. We ask Americans, what's the one issue that they find to be most important? What are they most worried about right now? And then we track this every month over time, so it provides a good landscape, a good understanding of Americans' issue priorities over time. Right now, the economy continues to be the number one issue, but not quite as dominant as perhaps we saw 6 months ago, 9 months ago, when inflation was much more pronounced, with about 20% or 1 in 5 Americans saying the economy is their number one topic. After that, there's a number of other major issues, including crime and corruption, including the environment and climate, immigration, healthcare, inequality, morality, etc. And I think the characteristic that really is most important to take away is just sort of how diffuse the issue landscape is right now. There isn't a single thing that has a large number of Americans focused on the economy, which is the number one issue. Only 20%, only 1 in 5. Crime, major issue, about 1 in 6. Environment, immigration, maybe 1 in 10, 1 in 11 or so. So it does, I think, really reflect how disjointed maybe the news environment feels right now, where there feels like there's a lot of things going on, and that is sort of driving a lot of what we're seeing here. But it is also going to play into the election and sort of the election climate, the election context. And Sarah will speak a little bit more about how Americans are feeling about each one of these issues before I then take it into sort of what the impact might be on the election. But not all issues, of course, or not all events are equal or have equal weight with the American public. This is from a series of polling reports that we've produced with our marketing and communications team, where every 2 weeks we are asking Americans how familiar are they with an event that happened in the last 2 weeks, and then how much do they care about it? How much does it impact their lives? And with this, we can actually sort of make a little bit more sense of that news environment that has so much chaos or so much noise in it, and sort of really start to talk about what people actually care about versus what they don't, what they're hearing about versus what they don't. And one thing that we found is that there are some consistent patterns we've seen. In that no care box, that box of things people are aware of and that they care about, typically are items that are very central to people's immediate lives that have an immediate personal impact. So the hottest temperature ever on record, most of America experienced heat waves at some point in July. It's something that everyone is pretty highly aware of and did care about, like it's something that had that immediate personal impact. Trump charges, also something people cared about. This is not the 4th indictment that just came out. This was related to the 3rd indictment, the January 6th indictment. The classified documents case. That was the 2nd indictment. That was in early June. So that's how quickly these things are moving. also in that sort of no care space. And then the latest interest rate hike from the Fed, also in that no care space. But then there's some positive economic news that isn't as well known. So inflation dropping, GDP growth, very important for people, right? When they read it in the survey, they're like, oh, this is important, but they don't know it as well. They're not as familiar with it. And then there's sort of more pop culture things that people may know or not know, but they don't necessarily find it to be quite as important, quite as sort of central to their lives. So this is something that we're producing every 2 weeks that we're making available on the Ipsos website. So if you ever want to check it out, certainly welcome to do so, where we're just sort of figuring out how Americans are responding to the news of the day. Now, to dig into a little bit more on those news items and how Americans are responding, particularly how Americans are responding to the economy, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Sarah Feldman, our senior data journalist. Sarah?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, like Chris mentioned at the top, the economy is the #1 issue for Americans right now, even though the issue landscape is quite diffuse. And what we're seeing when we look at our consumer confidence trend is that as inflation continues to ease compared to the highs we saw last year, consumer confidence remains in this middling position. So here we're looking at Ipsos tracking going back to 2002. Confidence is still lower than it was pre-pandemic and during a brief rally in 2021, but it still remains much higher than it was during other moments of economic turbulence, like during the Great Recession. And something we can learn by comparing confidence during the Great Recession versus this period of high inflation that we've all been living through is that, unemployment, job loss really weighs on consumer confidence more so than rising prices. And that holds important implications when we look ahead to the future. So whether the economy continues on this trend of low unemployment and easing inflation, or whether the economy takes a turn and perhaps we see an uptick in unemployment, those will all go on to have important implications for how consumers largely are feeling about the economy. And largely, like as we're taking a step back and looking back at the past and how that might impact the future, we asked another question in our Reuters polling about how Americans feel about the economy compared to 5 years ago. And largely across the board, most Americans feel that the economy is worse off than it was 5 years ago, and that's true regardless of race, ethnicity, partisanship, age, educational attainment. Majorities of Americans across the board feel the economy is doing worse off than it was 5 years ago. Now, there's a little bit, Republicans pull away from the pack here a little bit more so than any other group, and that is, mediated by partisanship and the dynamics we know about how partisans respond to the economy. But even still, majorities of Democrats still feel that the economy is worse off now than it was 5 years ago. And as Chris mentioned, the economy is the biggest worry on people's minds right now. And the main issue, what people care about, really drives political behavior in important ways. So, this feeling of malaise, this feeling that things are worse off than it was in recent memory matters when it comes to the politics of the moment and the upcoming election. And to kind of push and pull on this idea a little bit more, we ran an experiment about a month ago where we found that, if the economy does destabilize, we do think that the cultural war issues will become a little bit less important. And we found this by doing a really interesting design where we grouped people into 3 groups. We grouped respondents into 3 groups. The first group received negative priming about the economy. So we reminded folks in this group that, there's been historically high inflation, interest rates have been rising, and then we asked them what they were worried about. In the second group of respondents, we reminded them that unemployment has been historically low and that wages have been rising, and then we asked them what they were worried about. And then the third group received no priming about the economy, so we just asked them what they were worried about. And when we compare this positive group, this group that received positive news about the economy, to the group that received negative news about the economy, we found that Americans who had received that positive priming were more worried about these hot-button culture war issues like immigration, like LGBTQ or trans issues, like wokeness. And what that really tells me is that when Americans are feeling a little bit more secure about the economy and their place in it, they perhaps have more bandwidth to care about these other culture war issues. If you're feeling pressed about the economy, if you're feeling worried about your job or about rising prices, wokeness maybe doesn't resonate as much for you as a voter and more generally. And that will have important implications for how Americans go on to interpret the cues and signals coming from political leaders as they talk to the electorate about the issues of the day. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind going into Chris's section on the election and what issues people care about and evaluate each party on. So taking a little bit of a different turn here, we did some polling on opening weekend viewership of Barbie and Oppenheimer and Barbenheimer, so the double feature of seeing Barbie and Oppenheimer opening weekend. And we found some really interesting differences by political party. So culture war issues definitely popped up here too. Democrats were more likely to see Barbie. They were more likely also to see Barbenheimer, so seeing both Barbie and Oppenheimer opening weekend. And we really didn't see any difference in viewership over opening weekend for Oppenheimer. And what that tells me, what I think is really interesting here, is that with the conservative backlash to Barbie, conservative talking heads burning Barbies online, pushing back against the movie pretty strongly, we can see that trend in partisanship in who is showing up to see these movies. And we didn't see a political backlash to Oppenheimer, and we're not seeing that reflected in the data and who's showing up to see that movie either. And I think what that really underscores is how businesses and parts of society not explicitly tied to politics can go on to be influenced by politics. And that's just a really important point to remember as you communicate with the public and think about your own issues in relation to these hyperpartisan times. Now, with that framing, we'll go on to another big ticket item that Chris mentioned at the top, the climate and the environment. And this summer certainly has been full of extreme weather, the latest being the fires that have destroyed Maui last week and throughout this weekend. The environment and climate really are on people's minds quite a bit. 1 in 10 Americans report the environment and climate as a main issue, according to polling we've done with Reuters, released last week. And that's on par with other issues like immigration. And that really hasn't always been the case. About a decade ago, when we asked this question, only 1% of Americans found the climate and environment to be a main worry for them. So that's certainly grown quite a bit over the past 10 years. And I think we can really expect to see these worries and this issue linger as these extreme weather events stay front and center in the news and also in people's, visceral lived experiences. Cliff Young, the president of Ipsos Public Affairs in the U.S., has a great op-ed in USA Today out on how, concern with the climate will go on to impact the issue landscape and the politics of election cycles in the future. So definitely give that a read. It's super interesting stuff. But, the end of summer also means back to school season for us. And the issue of the culture wars in the classroom is also back in the news with the back to school season. So, I think one of the central questions hanging over this issue is who is in charge? Who should be making curriculum decisions? And when we look at polling we did with NPR back in the spring, we really see that, most Americans feel that teachers are professionals who can be trusted to make decisions about curriculum in the classroom. But when we push on that a little bit more and we ask who should be primarily responsible for making these decisions, we find that there's some interesting cleavages between teachers, parents of K through 12 kids, and Americans overall. Parents of K through 12 kids and Americans overall are really split between teachers, parents, and school boards being the primary voice in these decisions about public school education. They are much less likely to feel that federal legislators or state legislators should be the primary voices in public school education curriculum decisions. Teachers, on the other hand, are, pretty overwhelmingly support teachers being the primary party responsible for making these decisions about public school education, and then that splits from there between parents, school boards, and politicians. That all being said, I think the important thing to remember here is that most Americans and teachers do not think politicians should be the primary voice wading into these discussions about public school education. So that's just an important thing to remember as we go into the new school year and also into a heated primary cycle where this certainly has been a point of discussion. Now, politics has inflected the lower educational system, the K through 12 schools, but it's also certainly played a role in higher education as well this summer with the Supreme Court striking down affirmative action in late June. And in polling we did with ABC News, we find that a bare majority of Americans approve of the Supreme Court's ruling restricting the use of race as a factor in college admission decisions. More white and Asian respondents favor this, approve of this, than Black or Hispanic Americans. But still, most Americans feel that these divisive Supreme Court decisions are really being driven by the politics of the justices and not being driven on the basis of the law itself. And as the Supreme Court weighs into these divisive issues, pay attention to how public opinion generally and among these specific groups diverges or doesn't from the status decisions that come down, because that will hold important implications for trust in these institutions generally among the public and among these specific groups looking ahead. And on that topic, since the last time we spoke, the one-year anniversary of the Dobbs decision has come and gone. And in the lead up to that, we conducted some polling, checking in on how Americans are feeling about abortion and their access to it in this country. Overall, roughly 1 in 3 Americans say it is now harder to access an abortion in their state. That's an uptick compared to the last time we asked that question in January of 2023 with NPR. And that is really largely driven by the experiences of Americans in states where abortion is illegal or not protected. Among that group, 62% of Americans say it is now harder to access an abortion in their state than it was 6 months ago. So that's a notable majority there. As we saw with a number of special elections and in the 2022 cycle last year, abortion is a motivating issue for voters. And what this data tells me, coupled with what we've seen in elections so far, is that political energy around abortion really hasn't waned as we've gotten away from the anniversary and the actual decision of Dobbs from the Supreme Court. So an important place, an important issue to watch as we think about turnout and what's motivating voters looking ahead. And, in a more general sense, attitudes around gender and masculinity really drive and frame political support. So here we're looking at some polling we did with Political Magazine, where we asked a series of questions about American attitudes towards sexism, towards gender equality, gender roles, masculinity, and then we built some indices around that. One of which was our Modern Sexism Index, which really gauged, attitudes towards sexism today, whether gender equality has gone too far. Our second index, the Gender Politics Index, gauged how many Americans felt that men were under attack by key institutions like politics or cultural institutions. And when we look at these indices and who falls in them, and then we look at political support by these indices, we find that people who score in the top quartile of both the Modern Sexism Index and the Gender Politics Index are much more likely than the general public to support Trump. So, support for Trump is really mediated by these attitudes around sexism, around gender politics and gender roles. And, as we think through men being attacked or gender equality going too far, these are themes that really come up quite a bit in Trump's messaging, and certainly have come up quite a bit around some of the late breaking news over the past 24 hours with the latest news around the indictment. So these are important trends and issues to keep in mind as we think about the election, but I'll turn it over to Chris, who will walk us through the latest on the indictments in 2024 more generally.
Thank you, Sarah. So there are a lot of new information, a lot of new data on the indictments. There was a new indictment unsealed last night in Georgia regarding the 2020 election. We don't actually have data on that one yet. We will tomorrow. So we'll have to make do with it. The trend data we have on the first 3 indictments, which again is not a statement I ever thought I would make. But here we are. So this is from recent polling we did with ABC News after the 3rd indictment, the January 6th indictment, was unsealed in the federal court in Washington, D.C. And what we found here is that the majority of Americans find the charges against Donald Trump to be serious, 65%. Only a quarter say they're not serious, and then there's a substantial chunk who are unsure or don't know. But that is strongly mediated by partisanship, 91% of Democrats versus 38% of Republicans finding the charges to be serious, and independents 67%. But the politics has an even stronger impact when we move from the seriousness of the charges to should Donald Trump be actually held responsible? Should he have been charged with the crime? Here we actually see the clearest impact of that partisanship, where almost no Republicans say yes. Democrats are basically at the same level. The number who said that was serious, very similar to the number who said yes, he should have been charged. And then independents drop down, but if you actually look closer, that's mostly independents who lean Republican, who are the ones who are saying that it was serious but don't think he should have been charged with a crime. So this is very much the politics going, where Republicans basically are like, yeah, maybe it was serious, maybe not, but he definitely shouldn't be charged with a crime, versus Democrats who are very consistently saying it's serious, he should be charged, should potentially face jail time. And then what do we see over the course of these indictments? Well, you can see that as people have learned more, as these various cases have been unsealed, Americans are seeing them as increasingly serious. Again, we don't have data from this most recent one in Georgia yet. We will the next day. But you can see the documents indictment related to Trump taking secret government documents from the White House and keeping them in his Mar-a-Lago estate. Was found to be important, or serious rather, by 3/5 of Americans, and then 2/3 say the January 6th indictment is serious, mostly driven by changes in how many Republicans and independents see each one of those as serious. But while we've seen people's opinions change on the nature of the charges, we haven't seen the politics really change. And I think, again, that really reflects just how static, how entrenched the political views in this country are. We can see that upward trend in the seriousness, but on the right, the number who think Trump should be charged with the crime, that number has stayed virtually flat, around 50% from the first indictment to the third. And again, we'll see after the next one, but I would expect this number not to change appreciably as a result of the Georgia indictment just released. And then what are the consequences of this? Well, there is, of course, the framing that Donald Trump and his allies have put around it, that this is politically motivated, that this is essentially an attempt to push him off the stage. And Americans, by and large, actually are somewhat open to that. 46%, basically half of Americans, saying that they agree that the charges are politically motivated. Again, huge partisan effects, 81% of Republicans versus 15% of Democrats, 42% of independents. And I think it's hard to separate this sort of specific thing that this is people against Trump versus a more general distrust of the institution, distrust of the establishment that we know from other research is very strong in the United States. Basically 2/3 of Americans are, broadly speaking, sort of populist or anti-institutionalists at this moment in time. So that sort of messaging appeals to that group. However, there is the other side, and it's basically sort of as we see across a number of topics, almost the mirror image, where about half of Americans also say Trump should suspend his campaign because of this indictment, driven primarily by Democrats, with only a handful, though 1 in 5, a significant number of Republicans who agree with that. So, again, two Americas, two sort of diametrically opposed views, politically motivated witch hunt versus Trump should leave the campaign, leave the public stage as a result of these serious charges. And then when we sort of ask Americans about some of the details of these cases and sort of how they intend to see these unfold, we see that Americans do consider themselves to be somewhat well informed, 68% saying that they're very well or somewhat well have an understanding of the sensitive documents case, which is when we ask this particular question. That number is relatively consistent, though, across all the cases. And then when we asked Americans about when these cases should be tried, we do see that most Americans, at least when we fielded this in late June, believe these cases should go to trial before the 2024 election, certainly before the general next November, but even before the primaries begin early or late this winter. Upcoming winter. Now, this is from June. I think it'll be interesting to see when we re-ask this question in the next couple of days if this is held steady or if sort of the drumbeat Trump and his allies have done against sort of a a fast trial will have changed sort of where Republicans are, maybe driven Republican numbers down on these measures, and you'd actually see fewer Americans saying that the trial should take place quickly because of those partisan effects, not necessarily because of people's view of due process or anything like that. And these cases, I think, do actually matter. The indictments have not necessarily had a material impact, particularly in the Republican primary, as we'll see in a minute. But if their case does go to trial and there is a conviction, it does look, at least at this moment in time, like that might actually change things. So we have on the slide in front of you data from a Reuters survey we did just after the third indictment was unsealed. And we asked Americans, would you or would you not vote for Donald Trump if he were convicted of a felony and if he were currently serving time in prison? And we've isolated just the Republicans on the slide, the data from Republicans on the slide in front of you, and we see that 45% of Republicans say that they would not vote for Trump if he were convicted of a felony crime by a jury. So remember, most Republicans think that the charges are not serious. Most Republicans think that the charges should be dismissed, but if he is found guilty, it may have an impact. It may pull off a significant chunk of his support. We'll have to see, of course, if this holds up. I think you can never understate the importance or the effectiveness of sort of the conservative media and sort of shaping reality for Republicans. But at least at the sort of this moment in time, it does look like these trials might have an impact on the election. Now, moving to the election, let's look ahead to 2024. And I know we spend a lot of time talking about Donald Trump. The media spends a lot of time talking about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is sort of like, adrenaline or nitrous for the media. It really helps sort of goose the numbers there. But the next year's election is really about Joe Biden first and foremost. And I think that's the important thing to always remember is a re-election campaign is fundamentally about the incumbent president first and foremost, not about the challenger. Even a challenger as dramatic and as chaotic and as newsworthy as Donald Trump. It's about about Joe Biden and about really fundamentally about Joe Biden's popularity. And that's why we think it's always very important to look at his approval ratings. It's sort of the baseline measure of his political health. And what we see is that his popularity, his approval rating has been flat for the last year, basically, since about this time last summer when it did recover from an even lower point when he was in the high 30s. But he's been right around 40 to 42% approval of Americans who approve his job performance in most polling. And that number is a problem for him because when we look across a lot of elections across a lot of countries, what we find is that incumbent presidents with a 40% approval are about 50-50 to win re-election. About half the time they win, about half the time they lose. That's not a strong position for an incumbent. An incumbent should be favored, all things being equal. And even if Biden's approval rating was slightly higher at 45%, he would be a clear favorite. It'd be more like 75-25 odds for his reelection. So this suggests that he is going into next year's election at this moment in time in a somewhat weak position, and that he's vulnerable to being beaten by a potential Republican challenger. Maybe that's Trump, maybe that's somebody else. And one of the key reasons why Biden's approval rating has remained low, we believe, is going back to that main issue environment that we were talking about at the outset, and the economy specifically. Right now, most Americans look at the economy as their number one issue. Or more Americans rather look at the economy as their number one issue. It's certainly important to a lot of people. And right now, Donald Trump and Republicans are actually have an advantage with the American people on that issue. You can see on the right side of the slide, Americans give Republicans a small margin on jobs and the economy, +5 percentage points. And like the sort of the base rate model I just talked about of just looking at the president's approval rating, another thing you can look at around the world is what do people see them as the main issue and which candidate do they see as being stronger on that main issue. And usually that candidate who is dominant on the preeminent issue of the day wins the election 7 out of 8 times, basically. So, at least right now, with the economy being the main issue, that actually suggests that Donald Trump might have a slight margin going into the next year's election, or whoever the Republicans put forward, just based on that issue landscape. However, like we mentioned, the issue landscape is somewhat diffuse. The economy is not nearly as dominant of an issue as it was before. And indeed, there are a lot of these sort of social issues, a lot of these culture war issues that are also somewhat important. And indeed, you can see on the slide in front of you, almost all of these culture war issues, Democrats enjoy an advantage. And that's actually what we've seen happen in a number of elections recently, where the culture wars topics, the social issues actually became the dominant ones in sort of local conditions or local circumstances, particularly abortion. But the big lie about the 2020 election, trying to put forward sort of small d Democratic candidates in the midterms, and we've seen Democrats actually overperforming in some of these environments because they're so much stronger on these sort of culture war issues. And I think that's one of the uptakes of the experiment that Sarah showed you, is that as long as the economy is bad and people focus on the economy, the culture war issues are not going to be as dominant, but that's actually a better circumstance for the Republicans because they're in a stronger position. And then as the economy cools, the culture war issues will become sort of more important. People have the mental space to look at it, but that's actually a better circumstance for the Democrats. They're favored on most of those issues. So it's this interesting thing where Republicans are spending all their time talking about culture war issues, but that's not actually the best terrain for them. The better terrain for them is to be talking about the economy, which they don't talk as much about. I mean, a little bit, but their criticisms of Biden are sort of vague and empty, and basically based on macroeconomic factors. So they're almost sort of talking about the thing that will help them lose rather than the thing that will help them win. And you can see Biden trying to reinforce or trying to support his position by the speeches he's given in recent days about Bidenomics, sort of touting his economic record, because I think the White House recognizes that they need to improve this number. They need to improve his standing on some of these economic issues. But before we sort of get to the general election stuff, one moment to talk about the Republican primary. And, we've actually seen the Republican primary not have a lot happen, surprisingly, with all of these indictments and the candidates running. It's been somewhat stable. Trump has maintained a little bit close to just under half of the Republican identifying electorate behind him, pretty stable, pretty consistent. The one thing that we have seen happening is Ron DeSantis has lost ground from, being at like 30% early in the year, a little higher than 30% actually, late last year. And he sort of dropped over time down to being in sort of the low teens now. And I think that's as a characteristic of some of the people who are taking a look at him, thinking that he might be sort of the not Trump MAGA candidate, being like, you know what, he's not really breaking through and looking elsewhere. So we have seen some other candidates, particularly Vivek Ramaswamy, who is this sort of tech guy who is sort of very good at mouthing some of the MAGA tenets, but also has sort of an appealing background, is an entrepreneur. He's not a politician. That is appealing to the Republican base, sort of coming in. He's having a little bit of a moment, a little bit of a boomlet, though again, it doesn't look likely that any of these people are going to appreciably take down Donald Trump, at least at this moment in time. Though again, with the trials, with the cases, who knows what might happen, but at least at this moment in time, Trump is dominating the Republican field. Then if we turn back to the general election for next November, we can see that it is very close at the top line number, 33% Biden, 35% Trump in some of our most recent Reuters polling, 32% don't know. This is with all Americans. Now remember, all Americans don't actually vote. It's actually about 2/3 of Americans who vote in a presidential election. So when we reduce that sample down just to registered voters, we see basically the same thing. It's virtually a tie, 38% Biden, 36% Trump, 25% don't know, wouldn't vote, all others. As we get closer to the election next year, we'll start to apply what's known as a likely voter filter. We're trying to identify who's going to actually take part in the election, and that'll cause the Biden and Trump numbers to go up even more and the don't know numbers to come down even more. But I think the thing to really take away from this is here we are a little over a year out, and it's basically a tie. It's a toss-up. And one of the reasons it's a tie or a toss-up is because Biden is struggling to hold on to his 2020 coalition. So if you look on the chart in front of you, the Biden 2020 voters, those are people who told us in this recent survey they voted for him in the last presidential election, and he's only holding on to a quarter of those people versus Trump, who's holding on to about 4 and 5 of them. And that's a problem for Biden because he needs those people to win the election. Like if the 2020 election were to happen again, we know how that plays out, right? We've seen that happen once before. But Biden's struggling to hold on to them. He's losing some of them to Trump. He's losing a bunch more to sort of people who are undecided. And indeed, we've done some analysis that was released with Reuters where we looked at people who voted for Biden in 2020 but disapprove of him now or are lukewarm on him now. And they're primarily motivated by the economy. And they mostly think that Joe Biden hasn't done enough on the economy, and they themselves are reporting that they're hurting, that their economic well-being is sort of worse than it was 5 years ago. But they, broadly speaking, agree with Biden's policies. They support spending on infrastructure, they support spending on jobs, they support sort of things like that. So there are people who do fundamentally sort of agree with Biden in terms of policy direction, but they do not think he has done enough. And then specifically, they have very low levels of awareness of any of the policies that the administration has pushed forward, like the Inflation Reduction Act, like the infrastructure bill, like the pandemic era stimulus bills that were passed. So, you know, they're seeing Biden, they just don't think he's done enough. They think he's not really produced for them. Primarily, I think, because they themselves are feeling pinched, they themselves are hurting right now. And unless and until they start to feel better, it's going to be hard for Biden to make that case to them that he's been a good steward of the economy and help win back some of that support that he's lost. The other thing is that maybe they get so scared of Donald Trump, they come home. That certainly was a factor in the 2020 election, that sort of antagonism to Trump drove a lot of Democratic voters or Biden voters. But I think that's a harder thing because Trump fundamentally, he's not in office. He's not the president anymore, right? So he's just not quite as scary as perhaps he was in 2020. So I think that'll be not quite as powerful. So Biden really has a challenge over the next year of making this case that he's been a good steward of the economy. I think that's the key thing for him in his reelection chances. And I think for Trump or whoever the Republican is in the election next year, their key thing is about the economy sort of continuing to be very meh and people continuing to blame Biden for that. That's the key dimension, the key variable to watch over the next year and a half. But another variable that will be important is what happens with the potential third party. Remember, Biden and Trump are not very popular. Biden's approval rating is 40%. Trump's favorability rating is in the 30s. This is a circumstance where neither candidate is terribly well liked. And this is typically a place where you do see third party candidates do well. I think it's unlikely that we will see a huge number like we're seeing on the screen here. A third-party candidate getting into the teens or even the 20s in their support. Last time that happened was Ross Perot in the 90s. But even a third-party candidate who pulls off 5% can make a difference. Remember, in 2000, Al Gore lost Florida to George Bush by a smaller margin than Ralph Nader was able to gain in Florida on the Green Party ticket. So, these third-party candidates can have an impact. And that impact changes depending on exactly who it ends up being. So you can see some data from a poll we did with Reuters in July where we had a couple of different scenarios. One, that Donald Trump ran as an independent and Ron DeSantis was the Republican. In that case, Trump actually pulls in more support than DeSantis. I think that was sort of early telling us DeSantis' weakness potentially in the Republican Party, and Biden would win. Likewise, we have Vivek Ramaswamy running as an independent. He doesn't pull in quite as much support, of course, as Trump would as an independent. And I think he is pulling a little bit from the Republican side of the ledger. And then we have Robert Kennedy Jr. running as an independent, who is currently running as a Democrat. And that pulls a little bit from Joe Biden. But the thing I think that's important to keep in mind is a lot of this support, and I'll flip back so you can sort of see the two-way race, is coming from that third group of people, the people who say they don't know or that they wouldn't vote or they don't have a preference. Only a small percentage are actually coming from the two main candidates. And that's why a third party candidate really isn't going to break through, because non-voters are by definition non-voters. They're people who don't vote. And getting somebody who habitually doesn't do something to do something is a tall order. It is hard to do. And that's why you never see third parties do quite as well in reality as you will in some of these early polls, is because so much of their support comes from sort of these sort of non-voters, and relatively few from the two main parties who have regular voters, habitual voters, people who are used to turning out every year for the election. So that's it. That's what we have. Our next webinar will be in October 25th, towards the end of the month. And then after that, we'll actually start doing our monthly series as the election season really starts to kick into gear. So we'll have, November and January and February, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But mark down October 25th for that next webinar series. If you do have any questions now, certainly recommend you put them into the Q&A field. As Ellen said at the top, this deck will be made publicly available in the next day or two on the website, and all of this data is publicly available. It's on our website. I certainly recommend that you go check it out. This is only the surface of a much deeper, richer set of information. We're doing polling on the American public every week, several times a week in a lot of cases, so we have just a mountain of information to share. Then you can certainly reach out to Sarah or I at any time, and we're certainly happy to point you in the right direction or share any data with you, if and when it's useful to you. So let's see what questions we might have. All right, so we asked, first question, do we ask if government dysfunction is an important issue in the United States? Not in our main issue tracker, but we do in other surveys, and it is something that a lot of Americans say is an important issue. The majority of Americans basically think that government is dysfunctional, sort of in an absolute sense. And then when we have a slightly more complicated version of the question, where we let people select up to 3 major issues, sort of polarization and politicization of things is always sort of in that second tier of concerns, with 25-ish% of Americans saying that it's one of their top 3 issues. So yes, it is definitely something that Americans feel and are worried about, but it's not necessarily the number one thing, right? It's always sort of that second or third one. It's like it's the economy, and then it's the government not being able to do anything, or it's, climate change, and then it's the government not being able to do anything. And there is sort of an undergirding of, government not being able to do anything is the reason some of these other issues are problems, but that's perhaps a little bit more nuanced than we should expect people to report out here. Hey, Sarah. All right, historically, an election is a judgment on the incumbent. The extreme and polarizing sentiment about Trump seem likely to alter that paradigm. If it does turn out to be Biden versus Trump, isn't the bigger issue for Biden one of voter turnout versus sentiment? That's a great question, and I think that's fundamentally the issue, right? Is I think Trump has basically locked in his electorate. There's the block of Americans who support Trump, who are, extremely dedicated to him. And I think that coalition is probably not going to move or change a lot. And it's worth, in the last election, it was worth 74 million votes. I honestly think he probably has something like that still. That's about a third of the country, the adult population in the country. I think the question mark is for Biden. If Biden doesn't mobilize his supporters, if fear of Trump doesn't mobilize Biden's supporters, if his turnout plummets, then we could see Trump win based essentially on a lower turnout and getting more of his people out. On the other hand, you could see the opposite, right? You could see fear of Trump, you could see the economy maybe do a lot better and people give Biden credit, drive Biden's turnout numbers way up, and maybe he gets 85 million votes instead of 81 million votes, right? I think that's the real X factor. Trump and his vote, something of a constant, I think. And again, we can see that in all of our data. Opinion about Trump, pretty fixed at this day and age, but it's really going to be about Biden that sort of is that variable, and it is, I think, as your question asks, going to fundamentally be about turnout. And it does, you're right, it doesn't necessarily have to be people who love Biden, right? They can turn out and vote for him for lots of reasons. But that approval number is, I think, a good proxy at this moment in time for how much of that he's able to sort of pull in. Do you ask approval, disapproval for Donald Trump? We don't, because approval, disapproval is actually asked about his job performance as president, and he's a private citizen at the moment. We do ask favorability about Trump. We ask favorability about Biden too. And favorability and approval tend to be pretty close to each other. So they're decent proxies for the other. But our favorability item for Trump right now has him in the mid-30s. Biden's favorabilities, depending on which wave we're at, is in the high 30s or low 40s. So right around where his approval rating is. All right. I think those are all the questions we have, unless someone else has anything they'd like to log in here in a minute. Oh, we have one more. A lot has been made of the increase in crime in San Francisco. If we see more of that in other Democratic cities, will Democrats be inclined to sit out the election and let Republicans clean things up? Or are there other issues that could cause Democrats or Republicans to not vote as either a protest or to basically let the other side win without actually voting for them? Sarah, do you want to take that one with the various issue landscape stuff?
Sure, yeah. Crime certainly has been in the news quite a bit, especially in those cities that you mentioned. Crime ranks as a kind of second tier issue when we look nationally at these questions. And for Democrats, it doesn't rank quite as highly as it does for Republicans. That is an issue that Republicans and some independent leaners report caring a little bit more about. I think that crime also falls into that culture war category that Chris mentioned in terms of what is going to be more important. So if we see the economy start to improve, perhaps people focus a little bit more on crime and the issues around that, and that acts as a motivating force for people to either sit out the election or not, depending on what side of the aisle they're on. But if we see the economy deteriorate, I think that's going to really be the focus and what people are caring more about. Like we mentioned during the presentation, I think it's really going to go back to the economy and what happens there and how important crime ends up being in this election.
Yeah. Crime is an issue, though, where Republicans are advantaged. It wasn't on that slide, but the data suggests that is an area Republicans are seen as stronger than Democrats are. So the more salient it is, that is probably, I agree with Sarah that the economy is fundamentally what it's going to be about, but crime is potentially one of those issues that is slightly off from the culture war versus economy. It's sort of in that middle category that may or may not have an impact. Slightly separate from the national, but crime tends to be more of a local issue than a national issue. So it may have an impact in local elections more than we see it have an impact on the presidential election or the national election. Any other questions? All right, well, I think that is it. Thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for joining us for our August Inside Track. Please make sure to check out our website for all of our latest and greatest public opinion polling, including our forthcoming data about Trump's fourth indictment that should be out later this week. We'll also be doing some reporting next week with the Washington Post and 538 on the first Republican debate, which will be held next Wednesday. We'll be doing a pre-post survey where we talk to people before and after and sort of measure behavior, attitudinal change in that. And then, of course, make sure to join us again in October on the 25th for our next edition of the Ipsos Inside Track series. Thank you so much. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Ellen, and have a great day.